and welcome to this panel on measuring global influence, China-US competition in South Asia and emerging powers in Africa. My name is Abigail Kabandula, and I'm a research scientist at the Pardee Center for International Futures and the director of the Africa Center at the Joseph Cobell School of International Studies. This panel will discuss a new report that has been authored by the Pardee Center and the Atlantic Council that assesses China-US competition in Southeast Asia using the Formal Bilateral Influence Capacity, FBIC measure, or FBIC Index, a new quantitative measure of multidimensional influence between pairs of states from 1960 through to 2020. The FBIC Index attempts to capture the size of interaction as well as the reliance that one country has on others across economic, political, and security dimensions. The panelists will expand beyond the report, discussing the index in the African context as well. The panelists are as follows. We have Dr. Matt J. Burrows, who is the director of the Atlantic Council's Foresight, Strategy, and Risk Initiative, and is one of the leading experts on strategic foresight and global trends analysis. Professor Ambassador Maria Nzomo, who is a professor of international relations and global governance, director, Institute of Diplomacy and International Studies, the University of Nairobi, an expert in African international relations, governance, regionalism, and gender studies. We also have Colin J. Meza, who's a program lead at Diplometrics and Research Associate at Pardee Center for International Futures. Last but not least, we have Professor Jonathan D. Moyer, who is Assistant Professor at the Joseph Cobell School of International Studies and the Director of the Pardee Center for International Futures. To get us started, I would like to call upon Professor Moyer to give us the motivation behind the project, the report, and the collaboration between Pardee Center and the Atlantic Council. Professor Moyer.
Thank you, Abby, and thank you for everyone who's joined us and for our distinguished panelists, as well as those who helped to organize and support this event. It's very appreciated. This is an exciting day for me, not just because it's my birthday, but also because we're launching this report with associated data. And I've been working on this project for a very long time. The motivation behind this work stemmed from my dissertation, which focused on exploring the future of international relations with a particular focus on international conflict. In that project, I was very interested in thinking about how we could use new data that existed that measured various aspects of bilateral international relations, things like bilateral patterns of trade, foreign aid, arms spending, and how we could take these data and use them to build indices that helped us understand different characteristics of the international system. Indices are an important tool for thinking about measuring aspects of the world that we can't measure directly. So because it's very difficult to directly measure bilateral influence or foreign influence broadly, indices become an important resource. And so that's why we ended up focusing more on thinking about developing an index. This builds off of traditions that exist at the UN, measuring the Human Development Index, or the World Bank, thinking about governance effectiveness, and tries to bring some of those characteristics into the measurement of characteristics in the international system. We created a framework for thinking about how countries can leverage influence internationally, but understanding that influence happens most often not via patterns of military power or military capabilities. Often influence happens in relationships between pairs of states. In particular, when we think about how influence might exist, it relies on understanding how much two states engage with each other across multiple dimensions of development, things like security and politics and economics. Colin will present this in much more detail moving forward. We operationalized this measure and have updated the data. So the data goes from 1960 to 2020 and measures bilateral influence capacity across all pairs of states in that period of time. We think this is a real innovation because a lot of measures of international relations exist at the country level, and they're quite crude. Moving to the bilateral measure allows analysts and people thinking about the future of international relations to have new tools to think about how the world may be evolving. In terms of the relationship with the Atlantic Council, the Pardee Center has a long relationship with the Atlantic Council, and it's been one where we've produced a variety of outputs that look at the future of key trends and issue areas across different systems. Dr. Burrows is with us, and I've had the pleasure of knowing Dr. Burrows all the way back to 2007 when I was a graduate student working on various projects that involved the use of tools that we develop at the Pardee Center for International Futures, where I'm the director. So previous work in collaboration with the Atlantic Council has focused on things like cybersecurity, geopolitical risk, demographic risk, and then a variety of projects that look at issues related to Latin America development that are led on the Pardee side by Dave Bull, who's also an author on this research project. So I'm very grateful to be here, and I'm looking forward to listening to Professor Nzomo and Matt discuss a bit more about their reactions to this report, and then to join you all again in the Q&A portion. So Abby, thank you so much.
Thank you. I'll call upon Mr. Mezzo to just give us an overview of the report and the key results that we see coming out of this research. Mr. Mezzo.
Great, thanks, Dr. Kabandula and Dr. Moyer. Can everyone see my slides all right? Okay, fantastic. Yeah, so the foundation of today's discussion is the Formal Bilateral Influence Capacity, or FBIC Index. The FBIC Index tracks influence in the international system from 1960 through 2020 for nearly all pairs of states. By formal bilateral influence capacity, we mean the potential for states to influence other states' actions using formal means, as in licit, overt, state-sanctioned, internationally accepted actions. The index is not meant to capture aspects of illicit influence that, while used widely, are particularly difficult to measure. Note also that it's a measure of capacity. So the actual expression of influence requires an understanding of context and political will, and also cannot be measured directly. A state with high levels of capacity may choose not to use it. The index is operationalized using data that cut across economic, political, and security dimensions of bilateral influence, as shown by the donut chart here with their respective weights. So influence capacity is built upon two primary components: bandwidth, or the size of the interaction between states, and dependence, or how reliant one state is upon another. One way to understand the FBIC index is through a lever and fulcrum metaphor depicted here, where the length of the lever is the bandwidth of the relationship between countries A and B, and the position of the fulcrum describes dependence, or the relative symmetry or asymmetry of their interactions. As an example, the United States and China can have a great deal of bandwidth between one another, particularly given extensive trade volume, but neither is uniquely dependent on the other as a share of their total economic or security relationships. In contrast, it's common for many smaller oceanic countries, such as Tuvalu, which often have low bandwidth relationships due to their size, to be highly dependent on major regional and global powers for their aid, trade, and security relationships. Using the FBIC index, we've measured changes in influence capacity for more than 200 states in the international system across the last 60 years. These maps show some of that work, highlighting the top influencer in a given country in 1980 versus 2020, where the color indicates who that influencer is. States colored in purple, for example, are those where the United Kingdom was a top influencer in that year. Taking a look at these maps, there are three stories relevant to today's conversation that pop out. The first is the rise of Chinese influence. You can see in the 2020 map that Chinese influence, depicted in red, has spread around the world, sitting as the top influencer in several dozen countries, particularly in Asia and Africa. Our report focuses primarily on the rise of Chinese influence in Southeast Asia, a region which was once dominated by the US, depicted here in blue. A second story that appears when looking at the African continent. Here we see the retreat of colonial powers from Africa, where French influence, depicted in yellow, continues to maintain a strong presence, but has moved to the continent's periphery. A third story is across Africa, we see a rise of the other non-traditional powers. So this is depicted in gray. So in this case, framing competition as a purely bilateral affair between the US and China can at times be too simplistic, particularly in the African context. In terms of policy ramifications, we propose a threefold approach for the US's response to China's rise. The first is to deprioritize bilateral relationships in countries that are predominantly influenced by China, as vital diplomatic, security, and economic tools of statecraft are needed elsewhere. The second prong is to focus on strategically important relationships with countries where China has approached the United States as a pure competitor. Here, the US should rely on its influential allies in the region, particularly Japan and South Korea. We see in this line graph here that South Korean and Japanese influence among ASEAN member nations is substantial and combined approaches that of China. Specific ways to combine forces with Japan, South Korea, and other partners and allies in the broader region include joining multilateral trade agreements like the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, sponsoring Japan's membership in the Five Eyes Intelligence Sharing Partnership, and also encouraging Japanese South Korean detente and the creation of a Quad Plus multilateral organization. So that would include the US, Australia, India, Japan, and South Korea. The third prong of our recommended approach, I think, is quite novel, and it's to sort of support the further economic, diplomatic, and security integration among ASEAN member states themselves so that the organization can wield its influence collectively. We see in this line graph that the average intra-ASEAN influence of ASEAN member states is relatively small. However, combined, the total line there, the influence of all ASEAN member states in Southeast Asia far exceeds that of either China or the US. If ASEAN can manage to act as a bloc, it can mitigate China's rise and plot an independent course. Expanding beyond the report's primary focus and looking at the African continent, similar lessons apply. China's rise in recent years has been significant, and Chinese influence capacity in Africa exceeded that of all other single countries as of 2020. However, cohesive action through the African Union and pacts such as the African Continental Free Trade Agreement will allow African countries to boost their own influence capacity and more effectively counterbalance the influence of outside powers. The time is particularly right for African leaders to plot such a course, as the influence of traditional major powers and China in Africa is far less than the influence capacity held by, for example, France in Africa 4 decades ago. So there's a lot more we could unpack here, and I hope that each of you read the report in full and examine our data for yourselves to fully leverage the power of the FBIC Index. But with that, I'll pass it back to Dr. Kabandula and the panel to discuss these findings and share their thoughts on influence in the international system.
Thank you, Mr. Meza, and thank you, Professor Moyo, for those introduction to the report and to our discussions today. I will move on to talking about more of the maybe policy implications that this report might have for the US, and I'll call on Dr. Burrows to tell us a little bit of what he thinks the ways in which the FBIC measure could be used by US policymakers, and how might US policymakers think about positioning the US to counter the rising China global influence, particularly in Southeast Asia.
Well, thank you, Abigail. And let me start by just saying how pleased I am that the report has come out, and emphasize again, as Jonathan did, that the Atlantic Council and me personally have had a very long relationship with Pardee, and the reason that we started that relationship when I was at the National Intelligence Council was that the Pardee's work really shows insights that we weren't able to gather elsewhere. And I think it's been incredibly important, this particular strand of work, which is looking at the influence. I can remember when I was working at the NIC, we were looking at kind of just the base capacities of countries and trying to make a sense, from that, because you have so much population or GDP or whatever, what the kind of weight of the different countries were in the world. And that was very crude measurement. I think what has happened since then now is really to refine it and to really provide policymakers with a much more detailed analysis of where US influence is strong or weak, and equally what the changes are in the world, really from one in which it was very Western dominated, whether it was the US or Britain or France, and Soviet Union, and the Russia after the end of the Cold War was still powerful in its among its ex-Soviet bloc countries, but we've moved so rapidly away from that. And I'm not sure that for policymakers that they've been able to really grasp just how things have accelerated. Now, to get to the point of basically, how the US should begin to think about positioning itself against China, I think the crux of the matter is on trade. And as Colin was talking about, basically China got a real boost in Southeast Asia when it signed its free trade agreement with the ASEAN. And since then, we've seen China overtake the US. It is largely on trade. US did have a very big position in Southeast Asia, obviously, during the 60s and 70s with the Vietnam War. That was very much a security-oriented relationship. What we have seen in the past couple decades as globalization has taken off, and you've seen the development and modernization of lots of countries, it's not Southeast Asia, but all over the world, that trade and economic opportunities are a lot more important. And recent polling has showed that US influence, good feeling towards the US is strongest on the soft power side. There's resentment actually on the military side. And people are looking to the US to help with economic opportunities. And this is, of course, runs counter to where US foreign policy in the last couple of decades, it becomes a lot more militarized as part of the war on terror. So for policymakers, they have to kind of go back and this is a useful study to remember that there are other sources of US power besides the military. That, of course, is a hard lesson for many who are so used to using the military for a lot of purposes. And secondly, thinking about trade agreements, which is not popular in the country. So there's a recent study by Adam Posen at Peter Institute showing that the US has become a lot more protectionist, particularly since 2008. And part of that is because the idea that which was hatched during the Bush administration and the Obama period of these very large regional trade agreements, the TTIP, which was the trade agreement going to be with Europe, and then TPP, which was for the Trans-Pacific Partnership for Asia. And as we know, under the Trump administration, they ditched those efforts. And it's unclear with the Biden administration what they are going to do on trade. They don't seem very eager at this point to resuscitate those, even though in the case of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Japanese have kept it going, and basically the US could join what was already negotiated and about ready to be signed and ratified. And the Japanese have renamed it so it has a CPTPP now, but that would be the real vehicle for boosting influence. And that we'll see if the Biden administration will take that step. Other efforts, as Colin outlined, boosting ASEAN regional integration itself would be a good counter to China, as well as encouraging allies, US allies, to engage more in these economies. But I think the big lesson for the US has to be, we gotta get back into international trade. And with that, I will turn it back to the chair.
Thank you,
Thank
Dr.
you again
Burrows.
for a great study. And I think for us in the Atlantic Council, as you'll be seeing, articles coming out from us, and also we're trying to get the media interested in it. So hopefully we can also get more people in the administration interested.
Thank you. Yeah, you brought out key points about soft power and international trade that I'm hoping we can pick it up later when we begin the Q&A and engage more with our participants. But for now, I want to move on and bring in Professor Nzomo and to talk about FBICs, the use of FBICs in the African context. And I was wondering, Professor Nzomo, in what ways does the FBIC Index help African policymakers think about improving cohesion and self-reliance on the continent? And how might African states use this index to counter external influence?
Thank you very much, Abigail, and thank you to the Pardee Center for inviting me to join you to discuss this very important report. And I would really want to commend those who prepared it. We need this more and more, especially the world is moving so fast with so many changes. There needs to be some kind of reliable mechanisms for measuring reality, which is constantly changing around us. And the issue of power, though it is as old as international relations itself, or even older, it's like a moving target. It's very fluid, and it requires to be reviewed from time to time. What do we mean when we talk about influence? Some countries being large, small, medium, and all manner of titles that we give to power. And therefore, this formal bilateral influence capacity mechanism is a good instrument. And I would want to really encourage that it be disseminated to a wider audience, especially among students who are doing their research and they are looking for research methodology tools. Having said that, I would also want to comment on the broader relevance of this tool. And I would perhaps want to recommend that if there is further work being done on this particular instrument or related research on this issue of measuring international relations, that we look a little deeper into this question of power and where we want to domicile it. Because in this case, it would seem to me we domiciled power at the level of the state and stop there. We are living in the 21st century. This is not simply a world of states. The state-centric usefulness was there in the last century, but in this one, there are so many new actors, even before the 21st century, in the 20th too. A lot of non-state actors, very influential, some of them, many of them even more powerful than states, and they are interacting on matters of international relations with states, some of them acting quite without any reference to the state, but they have impact in places and among societies and peoples where they interact. I'm thinking about multinational corporations, for example. Some of them are quite huge. In fact, I would say the power of certain states, including the US and China, has something to do with the economic power they have acquired through what is done actually by multinational corporations. So it is their joint, cooperation on matters economic that has made the US so powerful that it has a lot of also multinational corporations that call US their home. And China too, although it hides under the label of socialism, have, for all practical purposes, is now using, capitalist strategies of becoming what it is. The state is still very much in control, but we cannot ignore those actors. So in terms of measuring power and influence, we may want to revisit that area to address also the power that is domiciled around international non-governmental organizations, NGOs, the private sector, the market, and even those we have learned to hate for obvious reasons, those who undermine the power of the state, the terrorists. They have a lot of power, and which is not under our control, but they actually chip into that power. And in dealing with them, how do we place all of this in our analysis and the tools we are using? So if we have to refine a bit more this formal bilateral influence capacity mechanism, we may want to look at that. And then this question of bilateralism, using a pair of states in order to measure influence. I'm wondering what then happens to multilateral relationships. I would say for China, for example, in its interactions with those on the African continent, it works in two levels. There is the bilateral and there is the multilateral. In fact, there is an overall forum created jointly by China and African countries, under which much of the interactions are carried out, multilaterally rather than bilaterally. So in other words, let's also think about measuring that as well, and how does it really work? And perhaps if you put it together with a bilateral, what does it produce? What we see? So that the map you are showing us here, which is quite good, it would need to also be populated with all these other intervening variables, if you want to call them intervening variables, into that framework. And finally, I also wondered if we get into the question of China as one of the so-called emerging powers, and under the framework of the BRICS, there would be perhaps need also to look at other emerging powers and how also, if at all, they are interacting with the US, and what is the whole interaction there beyond China. And that's why I was saying we may want to move away from just too much focus on China. There is too much, chasing of China, and especially by the US. The world does not start and end with China and the US. It has many other things happening. The 21st century world is very complicated and very dynamic, and has many elements that perhaps would need to be covered in a future revision of the tool, which I'm assuming you do as we go along. The tool will be tested, and I'm sure you may find some space for addressing some of these. But otherwise, a very innovative tool, I agree completely. It's a good piece of innovation, and I would again want to commend those who put it together. Now, coming to what you asked me, Abigail, to do, is to try to see whether or not this tool is of any help to African policymakers. And that's one. And secondly, whether or not it can be seen to be in any way contributing to perhaps giving us, those on the continent, a greater desire to address issues of concern like cohesion, self-reliance. And you did ask me to specifically address the role of the AU and the African Continental Free Trade Area, which I'll do very, very, very quickly because of time. The first thing I would want to say is, and this is again not to say the mechanism is not useful, is to say that the journey for Africa towards integration predates the concerns about China and the US. as such. It goes back to the very beginning, 1963. That's when this journey started with the formation of the African Union. And the one message that was ringing there as that institution was being launched is Africa must unite. It was, in fact, one of the founding fathers of the OAU, or the Organization of African Unity, globally well known, Kwame Nkrumah. He said very clearly, Africa must unite or perish, and was looking at a continent which they had just inherited, very, very fragmented, without any institutions and without any means for moving forward. And he worried that if the continent did not unite and begin the journey of integration, the entire continent would be vulnerable to all manner of external exploitation. That effort was not achieved as a whole in 1963. It took another 10 years for the heads of states and government to rethink that and begin the journey seriously in 1973 with what was then called the Addis Ababa Declaration, that stated that Africa needs a strategy whereby regional integration would involve an introverted, endogenous, and self-supporting growth for the continent as the only means to create social cohesion, self-reliance, and begin to find African solutions to African problems. Now, the point I'm making here is this was an independent initiative from the beginning. Of course, it has changed over time, and many things have happened along the way in terms of even subsequent legal, institutional, and other frameworks that have been put in place to guide the continent on this journey. It has been a very challenging effort, making one step forward and another one back, but efforts are there to see. Many legal, institutional, and policy frameworks, I can count up to 100 by now that have emerged, and very good one in terms of stating the vision, the direction of Africa. So this happened quite independently of the power issues of at that time. Of course, it was in China, it was the US and the Soviet Union in the midst of the Cold War. But I'm putting this forward to say Africa has had its own way of looking at the world, but of course has learned a lot in the process through many, many times of having its fingers burnt as it tried to fit in a world where power and influence was the guiding principle, who gets what, when, and how. The second thing I wanted to mention here, because it relates to what I have just said, African Continental Free Trade Area, which we are talking about now, is the most recent effort for Africa to move in the direction of integration. Certainly, it has been influenced by Africa's experience, even with dealing with China, with dealing with the US, with dealing with the entire West. And China in particular has, came with a lot of, can I say, enthusiasm as to help, supposedly to help Africa. But I think, an analysis done has shown Africa that at the end of the day, there will not be a balance of trade between China and Africa that will be in favor of the continent. And the only way this can be turned around is for Africa to create its own institution, very similar to the WTO. And that is what Africa Continental Free Trade is about. And it is being created, and there's a lot of debates around this, within a framework where some are wondering, and I'm one of those, whether it can succeed, given that we are stuck quite a distance away with another effort created by the Abuja Treaty in 1994, which is to move regional integration through what is called the Regional Economic Communities, the RECs, that divided the continent into 6 blocks. of that effort. And the idea ideologically was that those blocks, the East African Community, SADC, COMESA, etc., would be the basis for building the continental economic community as one unit to unite the entire continent. But you needed to go through these stages of building strong blocks, just like during a foundation. When you are building a house, you start with a foundation. That has not
Professor
yet...
Nzama, I'm sorry, I'm going to ask you to wrap up so that we can also allow audience to interact with you.
Okay, noted. So my conclusion on this is to say that this framework, the methodology, this instrument can be of some use. It helps to confirm some of what Africa already knows, that it needs to re-examine its own strategies of dealing with the outside world in order to increase its bargaining power, not just with China, but with the rest of the world. It is also a recognition that we have made some mistakes along the way, and we need to start now rectifying them on our own terms as a continent, and not just waiting to respond to stimulus from outside. And China's entry into Africa and its presence, we all know, has both positive and negative elements. But this is a matter that the continent feels it has to be managed internally by the continent in order to be able to meaningfully benefit from relations with China and its traditional partners from Europe and North America.
Thank you, Professor. Those are very, very useful remarks. You have reminded us of how complex the world has become, and the various stakeholders and actors that we have, and state and non-state actors, armed and non-armed state actors. And so that is also a very useful way of thinking about how the world is governed and how we states interact and influence each other. And also the role of African Union and AFCAFTA, and how we can use that, for African solutions to African problems. So that is very useful, and thank you so much for that. And if I might just add to your comments on regional integration, one of the issues that I've seen, not an issue, but a useful way that this index can be used is also in assessing interregional relationships. For example, when we think of the Horn of Africa, which is such a strategic location for Africa, and the Horn of Africa countries have for many years interacted with the Middle East countries. And so I think that the measure could be used for Horn of Africa countries to assess their own influence from the Middle East, and vice versa, how Horn of Africa countries influence the Middle East. And just very, very preliminary studies that we have done with my colleague, Colin Meza, who is on this panel, shows that we took just one country, Sudan, for example. We were able to see that historically, Sudan has been influenced a lot by mainly Saudi Arabia and Egypt. But these influences differ at the different time of period, and they also differ in what capacity. Is it security, is it trade, is it investment? But we also see that when we do the reverse, that Sudan's influence over Egypt and Saudi Arabia is very, very minimal. And so that's historically, but when we look at it today in our time, we find that that has changed. The relationship that Sudan has with Middle Eastern countries, we find that the most influential Middle Eastern countries in Sudan today is the UAE and Saudi Arabia. And when we look at how Sudan has influenced, be it the politics, the investment, whatever in that country, we find that Sudan's influence is really, really almost, I don't want to say insignificant, but it's very, very low. And so when we get back to Horn of Africa countries, you can also, this is a way of thinking about how we can strategize. These countries can strategize their engagement with Middle Eastern countries, be it in trade, in security, because the measure can show you which Middle Eastern country has the most influence in different aspects of the relationship. Is it in trade? Is it in security? And so Horn of Africa countries can leverage this information using their resources in terms of location, because Horn of Africa is a strategic location into the African mainland, Middle East, and the passage to Europe. And so they can leverage this position and knowing the interest that these Middle Eastern countries have to be able to bargain in a way that is beneficial to them. But let me open it up to the Q&A, and I see that we already have some questions from the audience. I'll read the first question and I'll see who will take it. We have a question, I think this is from Yaki Salevi, and I believe he's at ISS, and he says, great stuff. Do you assume a summation of individual country influence to come to the collective influence of, say, ASEAN? The assumption is that a grouping of countries has the same influence as a country of that collective size. I ask because in practice, the influence of a region grouping is inevitably less or below when compared to a country of that regional size. If one adopts the latter approach, it would require some type of scaling of the sum. That is a loaded question. So we have different aspects of these questions that we can share amongst ourselves. Perhaps I could call on Colin to take the first cut. Do you assume a summation of individual country influence to the collective influence of, say, ASEAN? Mr. Mezo, if you're able to take the first one, and then we can go on, maybe Jonathan can take the second aspect of the question.
Certainly, yeah. So I would say, briefly, is that, indeed our summation is an abstraction. So that said, given the gap between the sum of ASEAN's influence within Southeast Asia and that of China or the US, it's of such a magnitude that it's not simply a distortion of the interregional sums issue that Dr. Cilliers mentions. So still, it's a good point, and we're interested in actually creating alternative versions of the FBIC index in the future that look at things, for example, what an alternative United States of Europe, kind of scenario of what happens if Europe X sort of in an integrated block. And it wouldn't simply be the sum. There are more things we need to be concerned there. So I'll pass it to Jonathan to answer in more detail.
I think it's a great question, and I'd love to see more questions in the chat too. Feel free to add those or reach out to us after this presentation if you have other questions. As our speakers pointed out, this is a limited measure. And I think all indices are by their nature limited. The thing we're trying to focus on is trying to create a state-oriented measure that does connect to ideas that have been a part of international relations theory for quite a while, that look at patterns of interdependence and how interdependence can both be used as a way to create peace and connections between countries, and then how that can be imbalanced. And imbalanced interdependence can lead to expressions of influence that are non-military, etc. There are lots of limitations with this. Building on what Colin said and tying it to Professor Nzomo's comments, exactly, like the regional economic communities form the basis of an economic foundation that can lead to a continental integration framework that can also lead to an ability of a group of countries to be more interdependently related to one another, which can allow that bloc to speak more forcefully to external influence, if that's the goal of the countries in the community. As the African Union pursues the Agenda 2063 framework, which builds off of that starting date of 1963 and looks out to 2063 to build this integrated and kind of powerful, unified continental organization, that does blur the idea of what national boundaries look like. This kind of a measure can be used to understand some aspects of what that might look like over time. In the same way that Europe has gone about building this regional integration framework and thinking about the high levels of intra-European interdependence. When you look at the measure for European countries individually, they have very high levels of external foreign bilateral influence capacity, and that's because they're so deeply connected with their neighbors. So I think one of the insights we're pointing to in this from a conceptual perspective is that interdependence can cut two ways. Interdependence can lead to a shift in how decision-making happens at the state level, a shift in incentives, and that can lead to more peaceful relations between countries. But imbalanced interdependence can also lead to ways in which states exert influence that are outside of military-oriented approaches to this. But I just wanted to say I appreciated all of the comments from our speakers as well. Thanks, Abby.
We have another question from Alexander, who is an MS student in Global Environmental Sustainability. And I think this is directed to Dr. Burrows. It says, should the United States create more bilateral trade agreements with mineral-rich countries such as the DRC in order to assume energy security in the context of the renewable energy transition? Do actions such as these have the potential for mutual prosperity? Dr. Burrows?
It would be, I think, a hard agreement to put together, but certainly, you know, in talking of the DRC, there are a lot of rare minerals or the ability for DRC to you know, trade those. I'm not sure that bilateral agreement would be the right one. I mean, you're basically then, you know, just linking yourself to one country. I mean, I think it would be more ideal if the international community got together and figured out how they basically could help ensure Africa moves along to renewable energy along with the rest of the world, and constructed some packages on a multilateral basis and they wouldn't necessarily be trade, but some packages in order to incentivize the movement towards renewable energy, including, you know, the adaptation of technologies that are in more, you know, wealthier countries, that they can be adapted for the conditions of Africa, as well as to get Africans to actually, and we have a project, we did some work on that, looking at how African innovation itself can step up to the plate and help with the transition to renewable energy.
Thank you, Dr. Burrows. And we have a question, I think this is directed to Maria, Professor Munzomo. It says, when we begin conversations about decolonizing development, what can this mean for Africa and in its long history of colonization and imperialism? Professor Munzomo. Oh,
yes,
yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Let me start by making a small comment on that point about DRC and in a bilateral relationship with DRC. And it's really the direction I was headed to when I was talking about regional integration for Africa. Regional integration for Africa is a strategy which is not a choice, it is a necessity. Because even entering into meaningful, what you're calling interdependent relationship with, you know, a very powerful, you know, outside external power from outside the continent, and you expect it to be mutually beneficial as one country within, very vulnerable, very fragile within a continent, it's certainly not going to be a very good partnership. And that's why Africa has been pushing for integration so that Africa can approach, the world and bargaining for even what is theirs on the international market from a point of strength. A tiny country like Lesotho cannot survive, a bilateral relationship with the US. That would be a joke. The power differential is so large. We have 54 African countries. And I can tell you that this is a matter that has gone through very many stages of debate. So regional integration is a strategy that even makes it possible for the possibility of talking bilateral. And it is interesting, if you look at China, when I say China relates with Africa at two levels, the bilateral and multilateral. China constantly talks about China, Africa. It never talks about China, DRC or China, Kenya. And that means something in terms of power relations. So I just thought I should, put in that before this question about, decolonization. And I want to tell the person who has asked that question that's a very good question, because even what I'm talking about now, the regional integration project, back in the minds of the leaders, the policymakers on the continent, is this agenda of completely decolonizing even the mindsets in the continent in order to go in the right direction. Decolonization is a strategy. In other words, we got formal independence, but colonialism and the values associated with it, the structures have not really gone away. And that's why we have been on this journey of institutional building, of changing values and mindsets, of coming up with whole new legal and other norms. It is part of this decolonization. And I think until that is concluded, any form of influence, interdependent influencing of two powers of China and US interacting with the individual countries in Africa certainly will result in an imbalance in that relationship. And the statistics are there to show, every item, if you look for the last 10 years, related to international trade between even China and even the US, let alone China, the balance of trade is heavily in favor of
Thank you.
And when you look at AGOA, that relationship between the US and certain African countries, when they look at this new framework with China, it's a major concern. So decolonization is certainly necessary.
Yeah, thank you. And I think your points are very poignant in the sense that you emphasize on how these two actually can be used within the regional integration process. I have a question from Professor Aaron Schneider, and he says, in terms of policy, how might this index indicate the places and areas in which the US and China might cooperate rather than compete to resolve problems of development, climate change, peace, etc.? I think this is directed to Dr. Burrows.
I share your view that we need to look for places where there's a lot more convergence. I'm not sure that this index necessarily is the best tool or best means for figuring out what those overlaps would be. I think there are a lot of people, including in the place I work, but elsewhere, that are looking at climate change and how you could strike agreements between the US and China, if not much more broadly in a global, and worried that the current tensions undermine that. So I'm not sure, the short answer is I'm not sure that this tool is good for that. Looking for what areas of convergence, and given that climate change is a very complex topic, I'm not sure again that it's something that a tool like this can be helpful on.
Thank you for your honesty, Dr. Burrs. We seem to have a lot more questions, and I'll try and read these last two questions together, just because they still focus on the US. And we had a questions from Professor Timothy Shaw, who mentioned that why not focus on states? And I think we had dealt with that question when Colin and Professor Nzomo discussed some of the focus of the index. And so this one is from Bill McDonald, and it says, President Biden and other US policymakers have framed US-China competition as a contest over whether democracy or autocracy will be the ascendant political system in the 21st century. On balance, in terms of promoting US influence in Southeast Asia and Africa, is that the most strategic framing? If not, what might be some alternative narrative frameworks? Thank you. Yeah, sorry, that's up for Dr. Burrows again. But if Colin or Jonathan would like to chip in on this question, that's also fine. Would you like them to chip in, Dr. Burrows, or you're happy to take the question?
No, I'll take a swipe at it. I mean, to answer your question, I agree, which I think you're implying here, that the binary democracy, autocracy is not necessarily the best framework in order to deal with the problems that Southeast Asia, Africa, I would say a lot of places in the world are struggling with and trying to deal with. And certainly, I think the US will harm its efforts to help countries, for example, on climate change and reducing poverty, if they put on more conditions about whether a country has achieved democracy or country is backsliding to autocracy. I don't, we're looking at this issue on sanctions, for example, where we have those on Myanmar, what a degree to which they actually help the situation. And my belief that the US has to think a lot more about development. We don't really have an international development policy. Obviously, I'm in favor. Think of US lending support to institutions, rule of law institutions, but not to play this, going back to the Cold War and requiring countries to drop their cooperation with China in order to get assistance from the US. We saw that movie. We know how it ends and how it actually is detrimental to the countries that are caught in the middle. So.
Thank you.
Can I make one?
We are almost out of time, and I want to just ask our panelists, Professor Nzomo and Dr. Burrows, to say the last few words in 30 seconds. Professor Nzomo, what are your departing words? What should people go away thinking about in regard to this very important and I think quite powerful tool that we've created together with the Atlantic Council? And the same for you, Dr. Burrows. I know you did highlight a little bit earlier, but just your departing remarks in 30 minutes. I mean, in 30 seconds.
They're already over, Abigail. The 30 seconds. Thank you very much for having me over. And like I said at the beginning, this is an important tool, and it is obviously very useful in certain circumstances. But I'm being, brutally honest in saying that for Africa, certain things have to be in place before even these mechanisms can be really viable. Maybe like you mentioned in the Horn of Africa, in very, very specific particular areas. But that does not in any way remove our discussions about power and the role of power and influence, within, and outside the continent. There are very many other places that this tool could begin to apply. But like I said before, you may also want to improve on it as you move on so that its applicability and relevance it becomes more globalized and applied in very many different contexts. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Burrows.
I'll just say 50 seconds here. I think this is a great tool for US policymakers to understand, where their influence is waning. And also, by really digging into the index to understand the particular areas in which they need to do better. I think I will be extremely happy if the Pardee Center goes on and develops these scenarios and the capability that we can really play out different scenarios. Looking at some of the questions that we have raised, I mean, if the US puts more effort into certain areas, what would be the outcome? And also, I think the work with other countries together on such as its allies and partners, what that would help with in terms of bolstering Western influence.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Thank you to all our panelists and my colleagues, Professor Moye and Mr. Mezo. If the audience have any questions at all on how to use the measure, the index, please feel free to reach us. May write to Colin or Jonathan or myself, and the tool is actually out online on Tableau. You're free to use it, but feel free to reach us. And the report is also online. Take some time if you're interested in this topic to read it. And thank you so much and have a lovely day.